I'd like to welcome you all to this event, which is entitled Race Critical Public Scholarship, Challenges and Possibilities. We have three wonderful speakers, and I'm going to leave my colleague Renee Lenton to introduce the speakers. My job is just to say a bit about the MPhil, race, ethnicity, conflict, under whose auspices this evening's event has been organised. I coordinate the MPhil, and the themes addressed by our speakers, that is the relationship between knowledge and power, and the limited space available to an outspoken race critical scholarship. These are themes that are of central concern to those of us who are involved in the MPhil. And let me just say why. The MPhil has been going for 17 years. That longevity bespeaks of success, as does the record of our graduates. Not just the PhDs they have completed and the academic posts they have taken up, but the anti-racist work, anti-sectarian work too, political activism in various organisations and in public life in Ireland and elsewhere, notably on Israel-Palestine. Looking at this success, there are three things to note. Firstly, to get going, the MPhil timing was important. The MPhil began just as the peace process was reaching fruition, and Ireland appeared, for a brief moment, to be opening up and embracing difference as opposed to managing it. So that's one thing of note. Secondly, of note are the efforts of Renee Lenton, who coordinated the programme until a few years ago. An amazing effort on her part was crucial to the MPhil's success and staying power. But in the context of this evening's event, I think the truly remarkable thing about the success and longevity of the MPhil is that those things have been achieved against the grain. Success has come in spite, not because of the institution. And I think it's been tolerated, presumably because it has always been self-financing. Student numbers are and were crucial. They remain crucial. And with this in mind, I should tell you that we are having an open evening tomorrow, Thursday, between 5 and 6:30 p.m. So if you are interested in applying for a place in next year's programme, or know of anyone else who is interested, please come along yourself or send them along. You'll have a chance to talk to staff and students. We're hosting it on the 6th floor of number 3 College Green, above Starbucks. Starbucks and College Green. If you're interested in the programme but can't come tomorrow, please email me at the email address that was going to be on the slide. It isn't on the slide anymore. But it's easily got from the Department of Sociology website. I think that the relationship between power and knowledge is so tight that when we manage to wrest a little critical space from its suffocating embrace, we need to take care to defend it. The MPhil is such a space, and your support is greatly appreciated. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. I'm kind of slightly disappointed that we don't have the masses, but I know that since a small crowd will be able to engage in lively debate with the speakers, all of whom I've asked to just speak for 20 minutes, and then we'll have a debate, because lots of things are, in fact, crucial at this point. We dedicated the evening to Stuart Hall, who passed away recently, and I know that the speakers are going to briefly refer to him, but to me he's the epitome of a race-critical public intellectual who's been working for 4 decades, from the very early reformatting the New Left Review to the contemporary Centre for Contemporary Cultural Studies, to his work in the Open University, and he's inspired all of us to teach race the way we do primarily through his concept of race, this floating signifier, which I know all my students have seen, and sin again, to think about race and racism without a foundational guarantee that underneath it all there is a biological difference between people, and to connect theory and anti-racism is one of his contributions. But another contribution is that he always was aware of colonialism and decoloniality, and was always also an activist. And this is something which is not always necessarily favored by universities, often thinking that being an activist is something which doesn't quite fit with the academic kind of structures. And at a time like that, when scholarship in race and ethnicity proliferates, in fact, the university is undergoing a process of contraction and institutionalization, which makes it even more important to continue to talk about race and racism. So in this evening we want to talk about race-critical public scholarship in Ireland and the relationship between social movements and the academy. And we in the MPhil have always made it a point of working with civil society social movements, anti-racism groups, and open the university spaces for them. It's important to challenge the academy as I've written here, managerial, post-racial, neutral space. And therefore we want to open the possibilities of engaging with the racial state in its move away from the rights of minorities to categorizing population, managing migrants, and to highlight public intellectuals whose main concern is race and racism beyond the university's corporate ambitions. The MPhil is always engaged with race and racism in this way, and members of the MPhil and the department have also recently established a center, a kind of research cluster on conflict and resistance. And as I say, it's part of our engagement with civil society groups. But to speak about the challenges of race-critical public scholarship, we have three speakers, each of whom has done all of, I think, or have continued all of what Stuart Hall has set up. First of all, being both an activist and an academic, and secondly, challenging the powers that be in a great and wonderful way. So I'll start by introducing the first speaker, and I'll, before the next speaker, I'll introduce him. So the first speaker is Professor Gurminder Bhamra, and she will talk about the neoliberal assault on the public university, race and the politics of knowledge production. She's a professor of sociology and director of the Social Theory Center at the University of Warwick. She's the author of Rethinking Modernity, which I recently read, which really is a great contribution to reminding us that modernity is not only European. And it won the Philip Abram Memorial Prize for the best first book in sociology in 2008. Her current book, Connected Sociologies, Theory for a Global Age, is forthcoming this summer with Bloomsbury Academic, and she's co-founder of the Campaign for the Public University and involved in the new online social research magazine, Discover Society. Gurminder, thank you. And we hope that you all kind of stick to 20 minutes and then we can have a debate. Thank you very much.
Today, I really appreciate being able to have this discussion and in this space. I want to start by saying that the neoliberal assault on the public university in England appears to be complete this week, with government ministers even now accepting that the rate of default on student loans will make this system more expensive than the system that it replaces. And so there can be no plausible argument anymore about how the changes that they've made to the university, the higher education system, is about addressing the fiscal deficit, and is not, in fact, an ideological attack on the very idea of public education. For those of you who were here at John Homewood's talk a couple of months ago, the following summary won't be new, but I thought it would be useful to outline it in any event. Effectively, we're living in a period of rising inequality, where the top decile of income earners in the UK and Ireland now take home the equivalent of 35 to 40% of all income. This is a level of economic inequality that's unseen since the early 20th century. Changes in higher education policy in England are aligning what used to be a system of comprehensive public higher education with that of private schools and the privileges that pertain to that. The Brown Review in 2010 shifted the landscape of what education is understood to be for, and for the first time, education was presented simply in terms of individual social capital and employability. And the idea of creating a common culture and citizens that was strongly there in the Robbins report was no longer seen to be of relevance. So with the White Paper on Higher Education in England, the government brought in effect, a privatised system of education with fees and loans replacing public funding for teaching. And they've eased the entry of for-profits into the sector, for-profits such as BPP, the Apollo Group and so on. And they're also paving the way for the outsourcing of specific functions of the university, pursuing policies of open access and MOOCs, which are massive open online courses. All of these, they suggest, undermine many of the traditional functions of a comprehensive education system that's therefore in service of the public. Now, while these changes set the context for the talk that I'm going to give today, my talk isn't explicitly about these changes, although I'm happy to discuss any of these issues in the Q&A. What I'd like to focus on here, instead, is the racialised epistemologies that underpin the sociological endeavour and the social sciences more generally. Why this is now of concern to me is linked to these changes, and this should become apparent through the talk. So the move towards mass higher education, not only in the UK, but sort of more globally in the 1960s, opened up opportunities for increasing numbers of people who had not traditionally gone to university. People from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, women and migrants and diasporic people from black and minority ethnic communities. This demographic shift in time also had an impact on the knowledge produced within the universities. And it's no accident that it's from the 1970s onwards that there was a proliferation of critical positions and a concerted, although by no means coordinated, challenge to the dominant positions within academic debates. This was a period that saw the rise of histories from below, of women's studies, of queer theory and critical race theory. Edward Said's Orientalism was published in 1978, and the work of Stuart Hall and Paul Gilroy was beginning to make waves through the collaborative work that was characteristic of the Centre for Contemporary Cultural Studies in Birmingham. The disruptions caused by both the demographic shifts, as well as the points of criticism, had varying degrees of success within the academy. They didn't quite manage to reformulate knowledge production, or the intention was to reformulate knowledge production along more egalitarian lines, but it wasn't always clear that this is what happened. And what I'll do is first discuss the feminist challenge that occurred during this period before going on to discuss what I will suggest is the potentially more far-reaching consequence of the critical race or post-colonial position. The first point just to highlight here, however, is that this isn't an argument about identity politics or of the relative merits of the theoretical distinctions between feminist theory or post-colonial critique. It is rather a discussion of the place of these critiques within standard sociological structures and the possibilities of disruption thereof. The number of women entering higher education increased significantly, at least comparatively, in the post-war period. One of the first consequences of this was a growing realisation that women's lives and experiences were rarely encountered within the knowledge emanating from the academy. The efforts of this generation of feminist scholars, therefore, was oriented to rectifying such omissions. The norms and methods of social science were taken to be adequate, but there seemed to be a failure to address the different experiences of women within what it had deemed to be significant to research. Over time, however, there was a concern that it was the very methods of social science that had produced such glaring omissions, and questions were raised about whether the master's tools, in the words of Audre Lorde, could be used to dismantle the master's house. This led to a questioning of social science itself and calls for disruptive methodologies and epistemologies that would destabilise theory and research. This in turn, however, led to concerns about how could judgments be made across contexts if everything was destabilised. It's a cruel turn of events, Hawkesworth argued, that undermines the very concepts of equality and justice just at the time that women had begun arguing for access to them. Arguments about the missing feminist revolution in sociology made by Stacey and Thorne put forward the idea that despite the extent of empirical research undertaken by women and on issues of gender, the concepts of sociology remained immune to transformation in the light of such research. The arguments made by Ken Plummer in terms of the missing queer revolution follow a similar structure and logic. Ultimately, there's a concern that the insights of a queer approach to sociology have not required sociology to take those on board in its future research. So what is it about sociology that makes it so impervious to critique? And why do I think that taking the post-colonial racial, for want of a better term, into account would be any different? Part of the answer here lies in a consideration first of the very structure of sociology. As Habermas and others point out, sociology emerges late as a discipline, and it takes up the residue of problems not addressed by politics and economics. These are seen to address the individual and system aspects of state and market, while sociology takes up the issues of the intersubjective and the social aspects of the life world. In taking up the social, however, and distinguishing that social from the system, sociology also sets up the structure of the system and the social as an internal division to the social sciences and an overarching structure that incorporates both. So when feminists and queer scholars make arguments about the lack of research on women and gay people, there is an acknowledgement that these people had previously existed, and that there is a problem with the social science disciplines that neglected to take into account their experiences. The historical absence within social research is remedied, in part by now taking women and gay people into account in understandings of the social. To the extent that the system and social are understood as separate, however, they remain bound to the realm of the social and rarely have an impact in transforming ideas of the system or structure, which theorists believe can continue to be understood without reference to the diverse particularities that constitute the social. Insofar as race is constructed as simply another diverse particularity, that is, as ethnic difference, it also suffers a similar fate in terms of remaining firmly within the realm of the social, as intersubjective prejudice or identity. But there is one other division here which is significant and separates out race as a category from that of gender or sexuality. And this is the idea of the modern, and the way in which an understanding of modernity itself structures or disciplines what and how we know. The social and the system that I alluded to earlier are not just the social and the system, but rather they are the modern social and the modern system. And it's this idea of the modern that underpins the very idea of the social sciences, which are themselves seen to emerge as modern forms of knowledge. So in relation to women and gay people, while there may not have been research on these groups previously, there is a sense that they had historically constituted the modern social, or at least had been present within what is understood as the modern social. They were just missing from the academic analysis of it. With race, however, the deeper divide of the modern separates out the historical existence of those perceived as non-modern, usually those who were colonised and not white, and makes them the domain of anthropology, or then history. The division between anthropology and sociology, the division between the non-modern and the modern, is structured on a racial division that is harder to overcome through simple inclusion. To include the non-modern requires the reconstitution of the very idea of what it is that we had understood the modern to be, how we had understood it, and who we had included in it. It requires a fundamental reconfiguring of our understanding of the modern to understand it instead in terms of the connected histories of the colonial modern. Here I'd like to develop a link to Hall's work in whose memory this symposium is being held. For me, the most important of Hall's essays was The West and the West, Discourse and Power. In this piece, he wrote about the constitutive nature of sociology as formed by its understandings of the modern, and discussed the parochial character of the modern that was dominant within those understandings. He questioned the use of endogenous histories to establish an understanding of the West in its own terms, and argued for the necessity of more expansive histories to truly come to terms with what the West was, how it had emerged, and what were its future contours of possible development. He was concerned primarily with an understanding of modernity through the lens of roots, that's R-O-U-T-E-S, and not roots, R-O-O-T-S. The standard depiction within sociology and the social sciences more generally of the emergence of modern societies rests on ideas about the Industrial Revolution and the French Revolution, creating uniquely modern formations within Europe. Hall contests this internal history of modernity and points to the significance of societies outside of Europe and their contributions to the emergence of the modern world. To give you two examples, when we talk about the Industrial Revolution, we often talk about it as a European phenomenon. We talk about it emerging in Europe, or at the very least Western Europe, or then think about it as emerging within Britain. To the extent that we think about it as emerging within Britain, we locate its emergence within Manchester and Lancaster, the cotton mills specifically. Cotton isn't a plant that's native to Britain, let alone to Europe. It comes from India, as does the technology of how to dye and weave it. It was grown in the southern states of the US by Africans who were transported there as part of the European trade in human beings. The raw product was brought back to Manchester, turned into cloth, and that cloth was sold around the world, often at gunpoint, in order to open up markets that had remained closed to the British. And so in this sense, the Industrial Revolution is itself predicated on global conditions for its emergence. It is not a Western phenomenon, it's not a British phenomenon, it's a global phenomenon in its very instantiation. It could not be made possible without the global already existing as a space that enables the Industrial Revolution to emerge within. Similarly, within the French Revolution, you may be aware of the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen, for which it's famous. One of the key clauses within this declaration is the abolition of slavery that exists there. That clause only was written into the Constitution, only written into the Declaration as a consequence of a delegation that came from Haiti who argued for that clause to be included. This delegation was composed of those who had fought for their own liberty. They were previously enslaved peoples who had self-emancipated themselves and then travelled to France to argue for the abolition of slavery across the French Empire. So the idea again that the Declaration of Man and Citizen is something that's peculiarly French, well, in a way its most radical clause is a clause that comes to us from Haiti. So it's these roots or trajectories of modernity that tell us more about how the modern world came into being than any consideration of the roots or origins of modernity that otherwise preoccupy most Western scholars who continue to work in the Enlightenment tradition, seeking origins instead of beginnings, as Said distinguished. To take this discussion back to issues of the university, John Howard has used the work of Dewey to argue for the public university to be seen as the repository of the common learning of communities. Changing demographics in the 1960s led to changing understandings of what constituted knowledge, given that the communities who are now within the institutional forms of validating learning as knowledge had themselves changed. The entry of women, of people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, of black and minority ethnic peoples into the academy made it more difficult, specifically in terms of the latter, made it more difficult for questions of race and colonialism to be absent from our curriculum. This is not to suggest that progress made anywhere has been sufficient, but where universities have been seen to be public institutions and accountable to those publics, there has been a corresponding response to the pressure for more inclusive and decolonial forms of knowledge. I don't wish to present a rosy picture here of how things were wonderful then and how now they're terrible, but I do wish to acknowledge the forms within which some change, some reform had been possible, and the closure of these routes as a consequence of current institutional changes to higher education. The current changes are attacking precisely this demographic diversity within the institutional forms of knowledge production, and by reducing the demographic diversity of those within the academy, any chance of meaningful critique and resistance is also made more difficult. As Kimberly Crenshaw said recently, for theory to be different, there have to be different bodies within the space to make it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rominda. I just wonder, we'll leave the discussion for later with everybody. The second speaker is Dr. Sanjay Sharma. The last time I did business with Sanjay in Trinity was like almost 10 years ago, and we did something very optimistic called the Working and Teaching in a Multicultural University. it was amazing actually, because some of the points that were made by the students at the time, like halal food, space for prayer for Muslim students, and a clear route to complain about racism in the university have still not been implemented. Sanjay is a senior lecturer in sociology and communication at Brunel University. His work explores critical multiculturalism and the limits of anti-racist pedagogy. Most recently, he's been interrogating the technology of digital race and networked racisms. He's the author of Multicultural Encounters, published by Palgrave 2006, and he co-edited Disorienting Rhythms, the Politics of the New Asian Dance Music, published by Zed in 1996. And he's the founding editor of the online Dark Matter Journal, about which he's going to, amongst other things, going to speak to us here today. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks for the invitation, especially from Ronnie and the department. I'm going to try to pick up on some of the issues or the threads that Gominda has raised, and I want to try to do this in relation to the journal Dark Matter, which Ronnie mentioned. Although before starting that, I want to invite the work of Stuart Hall. It's working. Some of you may recall his influential essay called New Ethnicities. Anyone read that essay? Written in 1988. He brilliantly mapped the shift from the relations of representation to a politics of representation. What defined the earlier moment of the relations of representation were issues of access and inclusion for minoritized groups, their rights of representation and contesting exclusion. The politics of representation pointed to new kinds of struggles, acknowledging difference and alterity within as well as beyond groups, and negotiating the kind of complex terrain of being racially marked. Hall's essay, written over 25 years ago, remains prescient for revealing how the politics of race are dynamic, mutating over time, and the necessity to identify the historical conjuncture we're situated in. Arguably, we're operating in a neoliberal post-racial moment, which structures debates over multiculturalism, immigration, diversity, knowledge production, and the academy. The post-racial ambivalently suggests we've moved beyond race, but problematically delegitimizes any proper analysis of racism. When racism is acknowledged, it's often framed as an extreme illiberal event, such as hate speech, which actually obscures the continued centrality of racism in Western formations. Arguably, the post-racial marks a shift from a politics of representation to practices of what could be called differential inclusion. Globalization and accelerating flows of capital and information have rendered borders more porous, whether they're geographic, cultural, or institutional. This kind of implosion of borders has proliferated connections and relations, producing network societies, and these networks are generative of new kinds of power and hierarchy. So modes of exclusion continue to operate, but though now they're also in terms of this kind of network differential inclusion. So some types of racialized subjects, forms of difference, culture, and knowledge are recognized, so only some types. The banal multicultural celebration of diversity is transformed into more pernicious management and control of difference. Furthermore, we're in the midst of a rapid and seemingly unstoppable corporatization of our universities. As market forces and managerial modes of governance take over, we're witnessing, for example, the rise of an audit surveillance culture and academic individualization, the closure of unprofitable courses, increasing job insecurity, the rise of insidious metrics such as impact and value, academics becoming entrepreneurs, and students become customers burdened with a lifetime of debt, but particularly in England. It feels like we're losing the battle, maybe we've already lost it, If any of you are becoming academics, sorry for that, a grim and a picture of painting. And in this context, race scholarship is being circumscribed, made to conform to these market forces. The neoliberal university can subsume and even promote certain forms of race scholarship, but it does so by seeking to neutralise dissent, break up collectivities, and commodify radical knowledge practices. In fact, the academy is increasingly indifferent to types of knowledge production, because what only matters is the successful performance in the academic marketplace. So as academics, our work appearing in high impact factor journals, or winning research council grants, or the PR championing of individual star academics. This isn't to say that the neoliberal university has become colourblind. On the contrary, it's actually highly sensitised to race now, but only in terms of trying to incapacitate race from revealing how the academy actually functions as a machine of differential inclusion. The invisible whiteness of the academy today seeks to absorb many of us, including those marked as racialised other. Indeed, many of us can play the game of the academy, though we too can be co-opted. We become the game, cite Pierre Bourdieu, whether through promotion or publishing or learning the art of self-branding. If you want a definition of neoliberal academic subjectivity, I think it's something like, we believe in our own hype. Now, in response to these neoliberal post-shifts taking place in the academy, I've been involved in developing alternative knowledge practice through an online race journal called Dark Matter, which was launched in 2007. I won't ask the embarrassing question of how many people have heard of the journal or read the journal. Oh, a few hands, that's good at least. Now, developing a journal from scratch, and it was from literally a blank page or a blank web screen, has been a challenge. But by me trying to explore it tonight, I hope to sort of open up some critical issues for doing race scholarship. So this isn't a promotion for the journal. We've been around a long time and we've got enough readers. This is more about trying to think with the journal. Now, when launching the journal, there were at least three major concerns to address. Firstly, issues of funding, labour and technical and production skills, the kind of nuts and bolts of running any kind of journal. We're an online journal only. We have no source of income. We have zero profit, and that remains so in the 7 years. The journal operates on a free, or I should say, redistributed academic labour. So basically, I get paid, and I kind of redistribute my labour to run the journal amongst other people as well. Secondly, how does the journal accrue authority and credibility? We're an independent project, not tied to any publisher or institution, so we can kind of do what we want effectively. But you've got to ask the question, why would anyone want to publish with us? I'm not answering that question, by the way. Rhetorical. And thirdly, how the journal engages with the problematics of race and racism that are increasingly difficult to address in a neoliberal context. So Dark Matter has been developed to keep race central to the analysis of contemporary culture and to innovate the ways of doing critical race work. So whilst race work continues to exist, continues to expand, you could see it being absorbed in different kinds of subjects. For example, migration studies, where one can almost do migration studies but not name race anymore. So it's kind of weird. It's sort of swallowed up race and then and kind of dissipated it. Now, for those of you kind of interested in journals, and if you're a student, you do hopefully read journals, it's worth spending a little time on the economy of academic publishing, because it's actually a truly shocking state of affairs. We're in a situation that there are more academic journals than ever, and it's something we thought about when we started thinking about that matter. But many of them, but there's many less that are independent or not-for-profit. The abundance of journals is fueled by the hegemony of a handful of high-profit corporations. So publishers such as Elsevier, Wiley Blackwell, Taylor & Francis own over 60% of all journals. I realise it's being filmed, isn't it? We'll never be able to publish with them again. Now, I'm not making this up. Look at the operating profits of Springer, Elsevier and Wiley, and compare them to even a company such as Apple. And remember, my post and many other academic posts, publicly funded, we produce this work, the journals publish it, and they kind of keep the money effectively. Now, even some sort of radical left journals have had to sell out in a way to these big publishers, for example, Capital and Class and Race and Class, because they've been unable to meet the operating costs or compete with the privatised journal ranking metrics which these publishers have privileged access to. And as Ted Strippers has argued, this form of academic capitalism has created both a crisis of overproduction as well as the production of the scarcity of knowledge. It's classic capitalism in the way journal production has worked. So we can be radical in our work, but neoliberal capitalism can absorb and recuperate our knowledge practices. Some of you may be thinking, but what about the shift to open access? I mean, I don't know how familiar you are. Essentially, instead of journals charging subscription fees, we can actually access it straight away. But it's a bit more complicated than that. Now, open access has been at the heart of, sorry, the slide is slightly out of order. Open access has been at the heart of Dark Matter. Content is free, it's immediate, and it's unrestricted. However, in contrast to this green or diamond model, what's been called as open access, the dominant practice of corporate publishers has become what's called gold open access. Instead of subscription fees, the burden of inflated costs is merely moved to authors or the institutions, what's called author processing costs. Arguably for race scholarship, this situation is actually worse because unless you're grant funded, and most race scholars aren't, your institution will be the arbiter deciding whether your work is worthy of being published or not. Corporate publishers are effectively exploiting mechanisms of online and network distribution. The theorists Galloway and Thacker point to the protological control of networks. The sovereignty of control materialized through new forms of network power. Corporate publishers act as the super hubs of network authority. They are seeking to retain control of the flow of academic knowledge. It's difficult to resist these developments because there isn't an easy, ready-made, radical outside of information capitalism. We have to create alternative spaces. Galloway and Thacker encourage us to exploit what I would call hack the gaps and opportunities that the flux of conditions of networks present. Networks aren't static, they're dynamic. We can act in them. As Dark Matter is a digital online project, we think of our intervention in terms of race hacking in the academy. Hacking can be grasped as creating new things out of what already exists. Race hacking can involve repurposing existing practices for creating alternatives. Dark Matter began by identifying a means of online dissemination and production. We deployed the open source software platform WordPress to host the journal, so we use WordPress to basically publish. And we followed a kind of hackeress ethic of free labour, relying on open source software, and that partly involved customizing WordPress. I've got a bit of a background in computing as well, so I spent too much time doing this originally. I don't do it anymore. And so basically from the kind of original template of WordPress, we used another template, we hacked it a little bit, and then we sort of changed it to something else. And it sort of evolved over time, the journal, and we continue to do this. Now, acquiring authority and readership evolves through changing the form of the journal as well as ensuring quality of content, which is difficult to do if you're kind of a DIY project. But over time, we've gained a networked authority and reputation through the kind of alternative ranking metrics of corporate publishers. It's through how we're linked to how people cite us in a different way, not measured, say, from the Thomson ISI kind of metric. And our readers find us through different routes, which include, as well as search engines, particularly social media these days. And this is something about numbers. Our average number is something like 5,000 unique visitors per month. And it's fairly steady now. We don't put much effort into trying to track more numbers. We're a niche journal. We don't, because we have no profit incentive, we don't need lots of readers. As long as we think there's enough there's 10 people reading this, we think it's worth it. Now, in terms of where our readership is from, the dominance of Western academia and the English language and the global digital divide does mean that it's mainly Anglo-American. Having said that, with the long tail effect of network culture, we actually have readers spanning over 120 nations. And you can see the top 10 in Ireland just about squeezes in the top 10 of our readership as well, which is nice to know. In terms of the content, we've tried to innovate the form of publishing to encourage alternative modes of race scholarship. So it's only rolling content because we don't have print deadlines. And these are the things now traditional journals are doing online. We were doing this 7 years ago. We also have open-ended research issues, special issues, issues such as one based on The Wire, the US TV series, one on post-colonial sexuality, another one on Italian racism. So we can pick different kinds of topics. If any of you who've worked in current publishing with a publisher, you have meetings and the publisher will look at the statistics of downloads and they will suggest to you, why don't you have this kind of author? Why don't you have this kind of title for your journals, for your articles, because they're the ones that are most downloaded. So there's this sort of pressure now to continually produce and produce. Okay, I'm sure many of you are familiar with journal editors as gatekeepers and the kind of obfuscation of peer review and how that's central to the validation of academic knowledge. Work in the field of race has been difficult to publish because historically, because mainstream journals considered this work to be insignificant or they remain ignorant of the area. Here's an example of a review, actually, of a reviewer feedback on an article I submitted to the journal. And effectively, it was a highly cited race journal, mainstream race journal. It was just based on one reviewer, and the reviewer near the end of it more or less admits they didn't understand what they were reading, but they still went rejected it. And some studies have shown that peer review is kind of like a lottery, it's like flipping a coin. And some journals are publishing more than 9 issues a year, and partly to meet publisher demands to increase profits. And we need to ask the question, can you actually maintain peer review quality when you've got this kind of sped up overproduction? Now, the typical peer review is a very convoluted process. If any of you have actually experienced it, it can take over a year and a half to get something published. I thought I'd simplify the process. It goes something like that. Now, our intention has been to try to open up peer review, to make it more transparent, to make the process more transparent. Because peer review is a convention, and conventions can be interrogated and transformed. And this is particularly crucial for race scholars, and particularly emerging new work. Now, this is, I'm not going to go into this, but think about anonymity in peer review, the pros and cons of that. So we've been experimenting with peer review. So we've called ourselves peer review, partly to gain authority, but we do different things with peer review. Also, we've developed more of a wiki space to allow more collaboration, to develop other projects, which I not got time to get into. So we've been experimenting with the form of the journal to make it more into a project. So to conclude, Dartmouth's aim to sort of activate politics of knowledge, working with race as a fraught undertaking. Race is replete with instabilities, repulsions, affinities. It constitutes complex terrain the journal inhabits. So instead of feeding an already bloated neoliberal academy, the transversality of race needs to be harnessed if we are to make it to do political work within and beyond the university. And I hope the account I've offered inspires a kind of alternative imaginary for developing your own practice and resisting what's happening to our universities. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sanjay. I think we've heard now 2 very interesting, more like international perspective, and we kind of, not that Gavin is not going to bring us an international perspective, but I think it's going to end with something slightly more Irish, if our Facebook conversations are anything to go by. His title is Racism Between Everywhere and Nowhere, the Politics of Speaking About Racism in Post-Racial Public Culture. Gavin is a lecturer in media studies in the media department of the National University of Ireland in Maynooth. He's the author, together with my lovely daughter Alana Lentin, of The Crisis of Multiculturalism, Racism in a Neoliberal Age. His forthcoming books are the edited volume National Conversations, Public Service Media and Cultural Diversity in Europe, Hate Speech Online, Principle and Politics, Platforms and Practices, and Racism in the Media, and Racism in Media. And I believe he also is working with his co-author Alana on another book.
I'm lying to her a little bit about that.
Yeah. Oh, you're lying to her. Gavin, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much for the invitation to this seminar, to directly and indirectly pay tribute to Stuart Hall, and I think also indirectly to pay tribute to Ronit, who I think when it comes to race-critical public scholarship in Ireland has been an inspiration and an influence and a driver for so many people here in this room, and I think we'd really also like to pay tribute to her tonight in the most heartfelt and grateful manner. My focus is less on knowledge production and the politics of knowledge production, and trying to think more about conditions of reception rather than production, or conditions of dissemination, and consider the kind of things that happen when we use the analytics of race or the frame of racism to make a public claim, or as Sanjay said, to do political work. We know in general terms that knowledge production takes place and dissemination takes place in a context where attention is obviously a scarce resource. But I'm not just talking here about the question of not being heard, or of research that's forever in pursuit of an audience. Rather, I want to discuss the ways in which to speak publicly about race and racism is to be immediately integrated into an intensely political and constantly contested process of definition and denial. So what I want to focus on or discuss really are some experiences that I've had with the idea that we can name racism and intervene in particular ways, specifically in media spaces and in mediated debates, and to think about what that means for the kind of stock of knowledge and scholarship that we must produce under this framework of race-critical public scholarship. As we know more often than not, the mention of race serves as an invitation to disprove its salience, the mention of racism as an invitation to refute its relevance. Now, in general terms, academics frequently neglect to think about the question of the public. The idea of the public intellectual, which I intensely dislike, for example, hinges on the ethical and political decisions involved in the commitment to act in particular ways, but less on the complexity of the public which is to be addressed or reached. Regardless of their actual theoretical persuasion, a lot of the time, many academics have a little Habermas inside, and their inner Jürgen convinces them that research, or the right concepts, given the right conditions of rational critical dialogue, could make a decisive contribution if only the right actors were listening to them. Now, this is not the case in the realm of race-critical public scholarship, but when we move beyond the relationship of this kind of scholarship to social movements and activist networks, there's another kind of assumption, let's say a kind of Freudian desire to name and unmask racism, that runs up against the ways in which naming racism is not definitive, but it's generative of a host of counter-discourses and dynamics. And I want to focus on some of those media experiences and dynamics. I want to suggest that we need to add to our analysis of the post-racial, which Sanjay has already elucidated, to this post-racial political moment, a consideration of the significance of the media and communication environment and public culture that we inhabit, which, among other things, hosts and generates constant and intensive mediatized conversations and contests as to the scope, nature, and legitimacy of the idea of racism. Contemporary networked media, as Nick Coldry argues, constitute a ubiquitous invitation to discourse. This constant invitation to discourse, then, is also a constant conflict of definition and conceptual legitimacy in a putatively post-racial era, and a contest as well over who gets to define racism when everybody gets to speak about it. Now, thinking about media, public communications and racism inevitably brings me to the subject of this evening's tribute. Let's hope this is working. Oh, did I switch it off? After all that, let's see. There we go. One of the videos that I noticed circulating intensively after Stuart Hall's death, circulating in tribute to him, was this video, which is labelled online as Racism on Television in Great Britain, but is an extract from a longer documentary. It was produced for Open University Television, where he walks patiently and with great charm and charisma through the kind of trickle-down construction of the immigrant problem in British news bulletins in the early 1980s. He asks a series of questions of the material and for the audience that, as Sanjay has said, come from what we now recognise as his contribution to the notion of a politics of representation. Questions of who gets to speak and to define the problem on screen, what form of authority and what form of knowledge is presented, for example, in terms of numbers in relation to the immigrant problem. How does the liberal institutional practice of balance serve to give a platform to racist ideas, for example? Hall's production, his scholarly production in this area, had, of course, a pedagogic function. This was to provide tools for everyday practical deconstruction. But one of his main contributions to my field of study was his insistence on holding together how the proliferation of racism is both symbolically and materially produced. That is, media texts emerge from professional and institutionalised routines and practices, and the production of racism must be understood in and through these processes, and not reduced to the negative desires of particular individuals or the functional production of a dominant ideology. In one of his characteristically really difficult to get early essays, Black Men, White Media, Hall underlines the need to focus on the organisation of media structures, systems of expertise, the limits of generic formats, dominant aesthetics, the relationship of media institutions to other sacred social institutions, and so forth. As a result, he argued, dominant media was incapable of reflecting or exploring the social realities of post-colonial Britain. To quote him for a moment, this is because the media on the whole naturally gravitate to the liberal middle ground. They find conflict and oppression, the real conditions of black existence, difficult and awkward. They tend to redefine all problems as failures in communication. The broadcasting formulae seem to inhibit ordinary people talking in their own terms about their own experience to the rest of society. The visible debate, therefore, about blacks, conducted in terms primarily set up by the race relations industry, leave the vast invisible majority of blacks untouched and unrepresented. When the debate does surface, it is virtually impossible to hear any but a handful of middle-class blacks, like me, meaning him, and spokesmen for the black community, like most of the people in this studio speaking for the rest. On the whole, less articulate blacks are mercilessly processed and patronised when they do appear on screen. What inhibitions, what constraints, what forms of self-censorship, what shallowness of social contacts ensure that the media will be so deeply unrepresentative of the ordinary men and women in this society. And what marked Hall's pedagogy also was that he departed from viewing these ordinary men and women as passive recipients of ideology, but rather as fully, if hugely unequally, integrated into circuits of cultural production, an integration which ensured that racialized meaning could never be stable in the public sphere. Now, his interest in media analysis waned during his career, though clearly not a day goes by that would not have provided him with resources for his educational interventions. This is the Flemish paper earlier this week, De Morgen, which was masking President Obama's visit with a satirical issue purportedly edited by Vladimir Putin. And you can see here the apology of the editor, which perfectly sums up, I think, the kind of post-racial reasoning that Sanjay was referencing. We wrongly assumed that we could, as you can see here, make anthropomorphic ape jokes about Obama because racism is no longer accepted, and that in this way it could be the subject of a joke. Now, an example like this recalls that Hall actually produced much of his educational material in conjunction with anti-racism initiatives among journalists, trade unions, and media activists. These initiatives, the relationship between race-critical public scholarship and the media, are mainly a thing of the past. Media institutions, for a variety of reasons, have been market leaders in the institutional production of post-racial frameworks for the governance of difference. As Sarita Malik writes, a depoliticized racist diversity consensus is achieved, taking the heat out of the multicultural problem, smoothing over difference and deflecting claims of special treatment and rights, because we are all included in this intentionally, culturally unspecific and socially cohesive creative frame. However, there have been significant shifts in the relations of unrepresentativeness in media and communication terms that Hall identified. In keeping with his idea of audiences integrated into circuits of cultural production, the shift towards more participative communication resources has engendered an everyday proliferation of the politics of racism that Stuart Hall did so much, or politics of representation rather, that Stuart Hall did so much to theorise. This Flemish satire, for example, became an Al Jazeera story because of the way in which it was commented on and remediated in social media networks. This is not an argument about the democratising power of digital networked media, far from it. Rather, it's to observe that the expansion in the platforms, sites and flows in which the status of race and the salience of racism is endlessly discussed takes place in a context where endless debates about hierarchies of legitimacy and belonging mark the public cultures of Western societies, the differential inclusion that Sanjay was talking about. In context of more participative communications, but where also the problem of migrants, for example, Muslims, Roma, those others that are held to be corrosive of the sovereignty, values and hospitality of the globalized neoliberal nation, in other words, this is a sorting which is continually politically renewed, and where debating what constitutes racism is an everyday mediated concern. Digital media territories then are fully folded into political culture and the broader media terrain, and provide endless opportunities for the rehearsal of racializing strategies, images, ideas and memes, but also for their contestation. Race-critical scholarship, I think, in this context, needs to both account for and take account of, then, these public dynamics when it comes to the intention and form of interventions. In an interesting recent paper called Challenging a Culture of Racial Equivalence, Miri Song argues that, and writing very much in the context of the UK, that awareness of racial identities and of the dangers of committing racial indiscretions, to quote her, is quite pronounced. She discusses a range of generative public acts, for example, John Terry's racist abuse of Anton Ferdinand in the Premier League, Labour MP Diane Abbott's tweet to a journalist who was critical of the political passivity of black political leaders, where Abbott tweeted to that journalist, "White people love playing divide and rule, we should not play that game." That Abbott was then accused, inevitably, of igniting a race row, Song argues, indicates a growing tendency to regard, to quote, almost any form of racial statement made by anyone of any hue as automatically and indiscriminately racist. Her argument is not just that the constant mediated inflation as to what is or isn't racist empties the term of conceptual and political force, but that in fact it contributes to a culture of racial equivalence. That is to say, the accusation or assumption of reverse racism now accompanies a response to any critical invocation of racism. While the history of reverse racism discourses as a political tactic is well established, Song rightly has something much more diffuse in mind here. In a culture of racial equivalence, where we could add what I've called this constant invitation to discourse, any race-critical position that brings race into it is open to the accusation of reverse racism, where the reverse is increasingly redundant. Just constant examples of this. This was the other night, the Irish online media collective Rabble, who were looking at racism online. They posted, there's a debate, and very much immediately you have that, maybe you should look up the definition of racism, that denial that is always there that Sanjay was talking about, and this relegation of racism to something extreme and belonging to a particular political formation, which we have transcended. So for Miri Song, the political consequence of this is obvious. The analytics of racism have been denuded of their historical basis. Analytics of racism has been denuded of its historical basis, severity and power, and obscures disparate forms of racialized experience. In this, of course, the fate of racism has much in common with other political concepts that insist on historically established structures and relations of power in a neoliberal public culture. In her conclusion, Song argues that in order to counter what she terms the relativistic bent of racialization theories, for example, but also to engage in this kind of context where you can contest equivalences, we need, she argues, to insist on racism as a historical and structured system of domination that is differentiated from what she argues is better understood as processes of everyday racialization. Conceptually, I agree, but one of the issues, I think, is that race-critical public scholarship will not be exempted from these public discursive dynamics by offering simply more rigorous definitions, as these definitions have nowhere to stick. An example, therefore, that came to mind was writing with Alana as part of a series that we devised with The Guardian called Racism in a Digital Age, where the trigger editorially from the newspaper for this series was first of all a concern as to what was constantly happening below the line in their comments, and the increasing reticence and reluctance of writers of colour to either write for this site, never mind expose themselves to what was going on in the comments. But secondly, there was a kind of inchoate desire in the newspaper to debate precisely this culture of racial equivalence. They felt that something wasn't quite right with the way in which racism was being discussed. Race was always present, but always denied in its treatment in the treatments of society and politics in this space. Well, in writing about this initially, we also used the attacks on Diane Abbott for reverse racism as a topical anchor, and tried to lay out ways of thinking about these different racial registers that were at play, as opposed to racism understood as a structural and political force in this particular media event. As you can see here, just the first couple of comments, the first compliment was deleted before we had the chance to fully savour it. The second user is essentially getting some popcorn and waiting for what they see the inevitable. Therefore, it's clear to us that in this form, race-critical public scholarship, engaging in this form, in this mode, is actually generative a lot of the time of the very dynamics it's attempting to critique. In part, this is a consequence of the site. Comment is free, like so many online spaces, is imagined as a white space. Also, what often happens is that very much the mention of racism in the headline acts as a trigger for a series of scripts that express various forms of post-racial resentment, fantasies of preferential treatment, expressions of cultural loss, anger at the denial of experienced realities, and so forth. But there was a strong expression also among commenters that with this series, as many people put it, The Guardian is trolling its readership. In other words, it's patronising them that they need to be made to think about race, as they saw it. That is, that pieces which are offered in a framework of discussion were immediately positioned as attempts at ideological indoctrination, or again, bringing race into it. The challenge then, I think, is to find ways of thinking about bringing race into it, to find ways of advancing in analytics of racism that can draw out and bring in the salience of race while being prepared for this constant recursivity, whereby any mention of race and racism becomes a contest over their status and validity. I'm not suggesting at all that this is new. We know from Barner Hess that racism always depends on a version of its own post-racialness. We know from new racism debates as to how these reversals work tactically and ideologically. We know from literature on everyday racisms that the disavowal of racism is very much bound up in its expression. But what I am suggesting is that these new intensive expressions pose new kinds of challenges for race-critical public scholarship. And I want to just name a couple of, I think, in terms of thinking about Ireland, the things that I've just noticed actually quite randomly recently. One is an idea that I've found very attractive to think with, which is Ash Amin's notion of what he calls accumulated racial debris. That is the ideas, associations, positions, images that are built up over time from different historical racial orders. One of the things that I think that happens when we invoke racism is that this racial debris is organised around that invocation in a number of ways, communicatively. I'm thinking here of an example of debating for when Roma children were taken into custody in October 2013, and describing this as a racist act. But one of the problems was, of course, that the racism didn't stick anywhere. Where are we talking about the pseudo-biology of the fact that they had blue eyes? Where are we talking about the state's relentless surveillance and persecution of racialized minorities? Where are we talking about those folkloric notions of the gypsies as child snatchers? All of these, if you like, these different forms of debris, which are derived from different racial orders, were at play in the way in which that story was mediated. Therefore, to intervene in terms of racism, absolutely, became, if you like, incredibly difficult. The second is something that I took up with journal.ie, which is quite obvious example here, and suggests that when we also think about, if you like, the way in which this debris is organised, that it's also organised within a transnational space. One of the things that happens in Ireland is that examples from elsewhere, if you like, racial events from elsewhere, become ways of thinking about and talking about race and racism in Irish public culture. This poll, do you agree with banning the burqa, sounds almost absurd because it was a poll which was run by the Journal the day after a Cork County councillor announced that the lesson we should take from the London riots of August 2011 was the need to ban hoodies and burqas in public spaces. Something, if you like, that has already satirized itself. But through these kind of techniques and technologies of translation, the opinion poll, which is legitimated by, if you like, a media discourse of simply consulting with the public over an issue of public interest, what you find then, if you like, is the organisation of a transnationally derived racializing event within the public, within the national public sphere. Now, what I'm saying here in conclusion is not an argument for not intervening through these analytics or for insisting on the salience of racism. It's very clear from a lot of recent research that there's evidence at very many levels of the consequences of a lack, if you like, of a register for dealing with expressions of racism in terms of racism. I'm thinking, for example, of Sarah Ahmed's recent book on Being Included, which is about the experience of diversity initiatives in university context. To name the problem of racism is to become to name the problem of racism is to become the problem, having named racism. Because having named racism is to hurt the institution, which has already told you that it values your diversity. So again, there's a kind of continual loop at play there. I'm thinking also here of several researchers I know in contexts such as Norway, Denmark, the Nordic countries, which have a very particular relationship to the modern split that you were talking about in terms of conceiving themselves as outside of racial modernity, and therefore racism has no salience in thinking about public and political culture whatsoever. Therefore, academics who have talked about the generation of racism in the particular post-racial conjuncture of the Nordic countries find themselves consistently targeted in the public sphere for a lack of scholarly integrity, for a lack of objectivity, for ideological work at a moment where other people, to link back in with our discussion at the university, where other more objective scholars would surely make better use of the privileged position that they have. So quite, if you like, sustained and quite sort of clever attacks. So in conclusion then, I have no real conclusion as to these dynamics, other than to think that one thing that dawned on me, and Renee mentioned at the start, one thing that dawned on me in thinking about Ireland and thinking about the way these dynamics are translated was that I realised recently that it would be 10 years in June since the 2004 citizenship referendum, which, at least in terms of my lifetime, was the most intensively racialising public and political events that I can remember, certainly in Ireland, but also looking back in retrospect, can be seen almost as a kind of a template, a generic template, for similar kinds of things which have happened subsequently in Western Europe, which we always regard as being more the avant-garde of racism, frankly. And I was thinking about the ways in which this was derived as a citizenship referendum. The citizenship referendum was structured by the need to more clearly stratify populations in terms of their utility within the state. I was thinking of the ways in which the citizenship referendum was justified publicly by intensely racializing, sexualized notions of Nigerian women coming to give birth and to take from the nation, to take from its hospitality, generosity, and so forth. But also the way in which it was very difficult to oppose this referendum under, if you like, the sign of racism, because to consider it racist was already placed at the political extremes. So in other words, someone like Michael McDowell was very adept at saying, I won't let racists hijack the referendum, but I won't let the loony left hijack it either. So one of the things I was thinking then was not to conclude with a conclusion, but to conclude with an experiment, and to invite you to think about how we might mark 10 years of the citizenship referendum in ways that allow us to elucidate it as a racist event, while at the same time, if you like, dealing with the kind of dynamics that I've been trying somewhat haphazardly to outline here. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I think we've heard three very interesting and invigorating papers, and I think that it would be in the discussion, in the debate, which we have now, we won't just relate to the last request by Gavin, because a lot of the things that were raised by the first two speakers are interesting as well. But it would be nice if we also relate to Gavin's invitation, because I think we have a duty, those of us who are interested in race critical scholarship, to locate it within Ireland. And the interesting thing about the referendum is precisely that the whole population of people were rendered illegal migrants by the government, even though there was nothing, they were just made illegal by the government's action, even though what they did was not particularly in itself illegal. And Edna LaVey's new book, Pregnant on Arrival, theorizes this absolutely beautifully. So, please speak, ask, comment, whatever. David.
Yeah, I suppose actually I'll disobey Edith not to talk about the citizens' referendum first, and suggest that, well, maybe one way that we could mark the citizens' referendum is to discuss it as part of a more generalised politics of exclusion. Exclusion, firstly from public services, because if we remember what the citizenship referendum was won on, it was because all these migrant mothers were coming over using our hospitals, and they must be excluded from our hospitals because our hospitals were being overrun. So rather than like increasing during the height of the Celtic Tiger, spending on public services, the focus was on excluding populations. And if we discuss it in terms of the population being excluded, has been growing and growing and growing since the citizenship referendum, maybe then we can relate to the kind of plight to the racism to also the plight that a lot of other people are facing, just a thought. But I also want to actually ask a question, if that's okay. And the question, I suppose, is where everybody, all of you seem to leave off, which was quite interesting, which was relating to the publics, relating to the people outside universities. What the first speaker talks about, the different bodies that need to be brought in. I don't know whether it was need to be brought in to have different theories, need to somehow be included to have different theories. And I was very happy to hear Gavin saying that he wasn't a public intellectual, because I'm rejecting the role of the public intellectual, because that role is, of course, ourselves speaking from the privileged position of the university, enhancing other people's lives with our theories and our knowledges, where surely what we'd be talking about, what we're interested in, of course what you're doing in the journal, is a two-way process of using the kind of knowledges of people who are struggling against racism in relation to our own academic practices and vice versa, and opening up those type of conversations. And I suppose the question is, well, how do we do this? How do we actually not just open up the universities to this kind of race-critical practices outside the universities, but also like feedback and have this kind of feedback in these kind of spaces that you were talking about.
I mean, one of the things, so in the context of the paper that I gave, coming specifically out of what's happening within England, and it is specifically England, not even the UK at the moment, and the dismantling of the public university that's happened there, I think it is crucial for the sort of work that we're interested in to fight for the public university. And in part, it's because if we think about the period of the public university within the UK, it is a post-war phenomenon. And in that sense, it's linked strongly with notions of democratisation. So you have increasing democratisation alongside mass higher education. And so we have to ask, what is the consequence of now restricting, of shutting down the routes into education for the mass of the population, for making universities privileged places that are about the reproduction of social elites, and particularly now global elites, the whole internationalisation agenda that goes on, means that's partly what we're involved in. And it takes the university out of having a commitment to communities, to having a commitment only to corporations, shareholders, and so on. And so then you might say, well, what about all these communities, what is the relationship between? And I think that, in a sense, the sort of work that goes on outside universities always goes on. One of the things that universities enables is the validation of particular types of learning as knowledge, and that makes a difference both to the communities outside universities and to the sorts of things that we do. So it's not to privilege universities as institutions, but it's to recognise the space that they do have within the broader public, and to recognise the function that they play in actually legitimising and validating the different forms of knowledge production that's going on outside of those spaces. And it's vital to protect the routes into university for those communities and those groups who haven't had access to it, because that's what begins to change the dominant forms of knowledge production that exist. Feminism was out there on the streets, and it was also within the university, and in being within the university, it legitimated and validated particular forms of knowledge also outside of the university. Those changes would not have happened without women entering the university. And I know within some sort of traditions of critical thought, people sort of say, oh, well, you know, critical theory has the resources within itself to have come to this decision, you know, come to this at some point, and so on. Well, the point is it didn't. Empirically, it didn't. Same with addressing issues of race, colonialism, and these sorts of issues. They have not been dealt with until people have entered those spaces and said they need to be dealt with. So once you begin to have university only for the wealthy, only for the already elite, the sorts of things that we will discuss are the sorts of things that Michael Gove wishes to push through in the National Curriculum for Education, where he thinks that British history should be taught in terms of our island story. I.e. doesn't even recognise that the UK is more than one island. So that's what we're moving towards.
The Isle of Man, yeah.
Just a brief response. The university I used to work for, University of East London, opened a new campus in near Beckton, part of East, quite a poor area. And for the first few years, it was riven with robberies. Basically, the local community were coming in and stealing all our media equipment, and it was quite a bit of a headache. And it's only when the university kind of opened its doors, started doing more adult education course, made the campus more public, you know, where the borders of the university, the campus, the physical borders as well as educational ones, started to blur, did those robberies almost disappear. Maybe it's like a banal example, but it's a good example in the sense how some universities in the original format were very poor at actually bringing in the public beyond the kind of formal kind of educational routes. So that's kind of one quick answer. In terms of our journal practice, we've been in some ways acknowledging our privilege. The fact that I'm an academic, I get paid to read books and teach, it's a great job. And so partly we redistribute our labour to try to produce something which doesn't sort of feed the circuits of production, both in terms of publishers as well as the sort of forms of knowledge that are kind of seen to be legitimate. So I don't think it's necessarily about pretending we haven't got the privilege and necessarily feeling bad about it. I think the guy Stuart would say, you know, what do you do with your privilege? That's an important thing politically to think about.
I just want to answer in this respect that we have been trying to open, because I think one thing that civil society groups are short of is the space to meet, and it's expensive. So we've actually invited people to meet in Trinity. At some point we would have been stopped, I'm sure, but we were allowed so far. But also our research in the Trinity Immigration Initiative, at least my research, which was on migrant activism, completely and utterly depended on civil society. Without the participation of groups in our research, we would not have had the... So it's kind of, it's very reciprocal. Maybe it's not enough, but it was reciprocal. You don't think it's enough? No. Tell us.
Yeah, no, I mean, I actually do think that there is, when you talk about a university being used as a venue for civil society, I think it would be amazing if there was a spate of robberies in Trinity College that would, you know, force the authorities to open it up, because at the moment, there's a complete policing, and we know by holding these in college, you know, the venue might be free, but nobody's going to actually come. Such are the walls that have been established in the city between the college and then the outside world. So, I mean, how to kind of knock down these walls, I think, yeah, a lot more work needs to be done.
Yeah, no, I think it's true. Like, you know, we're kind of in the building, but not everything can come into the building. And we know it already from education and all the system, how to break the system. So you need to kind of work, for me it's a dance, and one step in and one step out, and you find a way how you can actually collaborate. But you need quite hard work to break this. It's not easy. It's kind of take time and seeds that you put, and it just grows slowly. And I think, you know, you mentioned all of you kind of, but it's a process that, for me, the media and using the opportunity to work with the internet in an open mind and put out seeds that you don't feel so isolated with your thoughts, as you can develop this network with others that think like you and support this movement. So we have some change, but it's still lots to do.
Sarah just to tell you she's involved in community, education community, can I say?
Yeah.
Yeah, without going into much detail.
But I'm using a lot the arts for trying to build these bridges between the academic and the community, and allow the arts to speak by herself without putting the title. And it's coming slowly.
Okay. Ken? Do you want to say?
Very briefly, but it's more kind of an anecdote, which is actually really an depressing one. Because I'm thinking about this idea of opening up the university, and then how we start to think of the university as an institution in a particular way. So it's a space that needs to be opened up. But one of the so I'll tell the anecdote first, and then see what I mean. Which is I was invited years ago onto one of these very well-meaning committees in the university for an intercultural campus, which couldn't at all have been faulted in terms of what it was trying to achieve. But one of the things I mentioned, kind of slightly polemically in the meeting, was that the campus is intercultural from 9 to 6. But what about the people who are in here from 5 or 6 in the morning, and the people that come in here at 9 at night? Because this was taking place precisely at the moment when the university was, if you like, shedding a lot of its permanent contract staff and using more and more agency staff essentially for service functions, and most of those were new immigrants to Ireland. Now, of course, this dropped like a lead balloon, but also the polemic was ill-serving, because what would I really be thinking of in terms of how we would then integrate the way in which labour was being used into the university into something called the intercultural campus? In other words, the university is actually a multiplicity of spaces at the one time, one of which is fully integrated, if you like, into the way in which the labour market was segregating, stratifying, and racialised. And another was, of course, the creation of a space where there was lots of goodwill for any form of difference to be understood as intercultural and celebrated. So, yeah, as I said, it was kind of stuck with me as a kind of a depressing realisation, but maybe thinking about the university as a kind of space of flows, not just an institution that has to be opened up in one way. But so, for me, what I took from this was the need to insist on the way in which we analyse the university as a certain kind of political economic space.
Just quickly, my grandfather was threatened with an excommunication for accepting a course in Trinity College. There's still a legacy there. And I remember, as I was saying, the cultural space we talked about. Sometimes you have to go outside, and sometimes you have to go further than the city.
Can people hear?
No.
Can you hear me?
You can speak loudly.
Yeah, sorry. Should have voice projection going. Just saying about the space. My grandfather was threatened with excommunication when he accepted a course in Trinity College. At one time, Roman Catholics were allowed in by the Catholic Church, by the way, not by anybody else. So I'm just saying, what we need to look at is maybe the application outside of the walls of academia. I work in the Moffat University in Leicester, and we run Black History Month, and it's very successful with the community in Leicester. And we do other festivals as well and debates. So I think it might be worthwhile looking at that. Maybe in Gavin's call for something, commemoration of 10 years of the so-called, we call it the racist referendum. maybe get the masters, the 4 masters of the maternity hospitals who disputed McDowell, the Minister for Justice at the time, or Injustice, as he was called, who disputed his claim that the women, pregnant women were coming to Ireland, have babies, and they were choking up our maternity, you mentioned the maternity ones, which they disputed, and he basically lied. He said that he was told by the masters that this was the case, and it wasn't, in fact. So it was based on a lie. But just on Stuart Hall, I remember talking to Stuart Hall in Marxism Today workshop over in London years ago, in the 80s, and we were talking about football. He was a cricket fan, we were talking about football. John Barnes was around at the time, one of the first popular black footballers playing for Watford. And he said, it was interesting what he said, he made a forecast. He said they'd be just used by the media for people's entertainment. And when the players start retiring and they becoming coaches, they definitely won't be brought into management. And how true that was all these years later, we still only have one single Chris Hughton as the main manager in Premier League. I should have went out to Paddy Paris and put it down on him because he predicted this. And I think that's really interesting that the media, they never discussed this. You might not time in the newspaper, but never on TV. They all talk about the absence of black managers in football. And it's at the same time it's more sure that the players playing in Premier League mustn't come from Ivory Coast and Ghana, for example.
Yeah.
I just wanted to ask, what advice do you give PhD students who are now entering this sort of kind of not business of academics, who do want to sort of change what's going on? Because as Renee, like being in Trinity, like I keep my academic work separate because honestly, academically, when I apply for a university, who's going to really care or notice unless I published in the journal that you said that is making a lot of profit? And what advice do you sort of give the upcoming PhD students who are non-established, who fret about being unemployed after so many years, trying really hard to be employed, and at the same time trying to this idea of opening up the university?
Well, that's a tough one, particularly in, again, I mean, in the English context, it's particularly worse. I think it's not as bad in Scotland, Wales, and I'm not sure what the situation is here, so other people can perhaps speak to that. But I mean, in that context, there's a couple of things to distinguish. So no matter how bad things are in terms of the absolute dismantling of the public higher education system, life for academics who are on permanent contracts is still pretty good. So it's not as if the job has become so intensive that it's undoable. You still have a lot of autonomy, there's still a lot of space to do the sort of intellectual work that you wish to do, and there are all these demands around audit, managerialism, all that sort of stuff is creeping in. But it is still nonetheless an incredibly privileged position. But what's becoming more difficult are the routes in, and this is partly the question that you're sort of asking. So the routes in are closing down. There's beginning to be an increase of hiring people on temporary contracts, part-time contracts, and the full-time ones are disappearing a little bit. But it's still at a point where it could change. So things are incredibly in flux at the moment. And I would sort of say that in a way there are things that you have to do and there are things that you have to do no matter what you're doing, where you have to meet particular measures in order to be in a position to apply for jobs and compete effectively and so on, but they don't require 100% of your time. You can still carve out time to do other things, do the things that you wish to do, and still, so it's a question of balancing those aspects. There are things that you will need to do, and that's just the way in which things are in the university sector. But if you meet those, that doesn't have to dominate your life. You don't have to do double the amount. You don't have to do triple the amount. You can just do what's required, and then spend the rest of the time doing other things. And I think that that's just about applicable still at the moment.
Just briefly, I think it's very difficult now. I tell my PhD students to be very tactical and strategic, I suppose in a similar way You have to do certain things if you're doing a PhD, even trying to publish something whilst you're writing a PhD, particularly afterwards, even if you get part-time work, just keep publishing. They're the sort of metrics that one's measured against. Having said all that, I see a new generation of PhD students emerging who are very career-centred, who are like machines in knowing I've got to do this, this and this to get a job. And unfortunately, they're kind of career academics where I don't see a politics in their work. They see academia as a career, and maybe that's what's happening now, and it's very hard to stop. But without sounding kind of cheesy, you've got to keep your politics. I think if you want to lose your politics, then you become a kind of part of the corporate machine, and you might as well be working in some other corporation as opposed to academia. And enough of us have to keep that politics, to keep the kind of spirit of public university alive. So stick to your guns, but know what you're getting into.
How much help do you think comes from the higher levels of the idea of sticking to your guns? Like, I know obviously you guys are very supportive to this, but in like an average, do you think there's a lot more help? Sort of to encourage.
You have to create networks. I think it's about finding those people out, because sometimes those people don't make themselves visible, because they might be under pressure themselves. You have to have a lot more agency than maybe before. There's less of us than before as well, but there's enough people out there to connect them.
Yeah, no, nothing really to add other than to say that sound advice. I mean, you call keeping your politics cheesy. I don't think it is. I think that there's also one of the consequences of the industry of academic production that Sanjay was outlining was that there's just an enormous amount of stuff that people do recognise as essentially kind of academic business cards. You know, these are being published because you have to publish them. So there's an awful lot of stuff which is there, which has already given up, if you like, on its politics. Or I think it's given up on its problematic. In other words, one of the things that motivates and sustains good, not just good research, but a good intellectual, political project is that there is a problematic that motivates you and keeps producing research questions that you want to follow. And I think that's perfectly compatible with the kind of strategic approach that you've been talking about, which is that there will always be, you know, for example, things that you need to publish essentially for the sake of it, aware that you might as well be opening the window sometimes and reading it out into the street for the amount of readership that it will generate. There's a level of absurdity about academic knowledge production, which, if it were to be acknowledged, I think would, well, it's kind of acknowledged anyway, but I'm not sure it's a level of absurdity that can sustain itself. So I think within that there are an exploitation, not just absurdity that can sustain itself. So within that, I think this notion of allowing your own interest to generate a problematic, which is sustaining and being strategic, but also I think you mentioned activism as well as part of the, you know, part of the problem profile. In some ways I don't think it is, because I think it extends to what Sanjay was saying about neoliberal universities being almost agnostic as to what the research is about, as long as it has some kind of impact. I think this is, and there's many people in universities disappointed, in fact, that their ground political statements haven't gotten them into, you know, more trouble. A lot of the time the university is actually kind of agnostic about activism as well, and in fact it sometimes just becomes kind of bankable under community outreach and all of these other frameworks which are emerging to quantify and categorize forms of academic value. So I think that it's not something which you need to think is somehow potentially punishable in terms of the way in which, I think, but again, there might be very different experiences of that.
Well, Vanessa actually is the editor of a journal of the Anti-Racist Network. And, you know, this is her activism, a contribution, but it may not be considered when it comes to promotion or to jobs. This is there's no zero impact factor. You know. Anyway, there was Luke first and then the lady there. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll just have to come down to talk
Speak
about
up to.
the contribution was just to talk about space, the one the Jeff spoke about. Because for some of us, the way we know Stuart Hall, we didn't consider much as academic. He was actually an activist. He was someone who was where the people were. And by the time he was writing, it was something that he was, from his own experiences as well. So I think when we talk about space, about universities to open up, that has to be both ways. To be for the physical space, whereby like some of us to be able to come here and do our meetings, as well as academics also to go where the community are meeting and share the ideas. In fact, that I think 2 years ago there was a seminar for the Somali community which was done by the same department. That was very important because it opened so much for some of the young Somali people to see that university was not as scary as those buildings, the cities, but it was a space which they can also aspire to go and participate. And I could also say that the way we were even conducted by the department in anti-racism network and be able to do collaborations, it was also very, very important. But I think to encourage especially PhD students to be proactive in activism, I think it is the only way they can get challenged and also share their knowledge with real people, as we talk about feminists, anti-racist people on the ground, than just rely on what has been written before. Even for Stuart Hall, when he wrote about culture or even about economy, he was able to bring that Marxist, from the left, to bring it because it was something he was experiencing himself. So I just think that maybe universities, there's a big challenge to find or to nurture those ideas that Stuart Hall was trying, that he has done. Because I don't really think that he was just a cultural academic, as some of our reviews were saying. There was something more about it, and it is something which can be done by participating on the ground with some grassroots groups. So
maybe we take the lady there, and yeah? No, behind you.
Three more here. Just as a sort of follow-up and a challenge to some of what was said in relation to being a PhD student, I actually find it to be quite difficult to do the balancing and to publish in the journals when with this. I'm not sure what the situation is in England, but definitely in Ireland, and depending on what kind of background you come from, especially if you're an immigrant to this country, because I know from my personal experience anyway here is that I teach a course in this university, and after that I go and do a job working in a cafe to make ends meet, and I'm also an activist, and I find it very hard to balance all those things. I find it very hard to even write my dissertation sometimes. And I don't think that we are meant necessarily to balance all of those things. I don't think it's humanly possible, really, to be honest. But I think that a possible maybe way of addressing it is more solidarity from within the university, especially from academics who you were talking about that have privilege within the university, who have permanent positions within the university, not accepting that their PhD students teach however many hours without any pay, not accepting that you hire people to teach one course and not really get paid, in any way as of someone with a permanent position. I think that kind of solidarity is needed, and even solidarity between students in the university itself, like within postgraduates in this university. If we all together said we're not going to do teaching and not get paid, I think that kind of solidarity would go a lot further, in addressing that.
Sorry, just on that, I'm wondering, Sinead, you've had some contacts, haven't you, with the kind of organisation of precarious academic staff to Sinead Kennedy was there.
Yeah, I believe we have tried to kind of do some organisation around that because there is so much of that in the universities now of taking on people to teach one course. And so many people's experience is going around the Dublin universities, the kind of 4 universities in the 1 week and doing all of those hours. So we are trying to organise not just within, kind of across, certainly within the Dublin university. So maybe we could talk about that at the end. But I think that there has to be, I think you're absolutely right, I think there has to be solidarity within the universities with people who have permanent, tenured positions. But also I think it is possible to organise, and maybe, I know in Britain, some people have been talking about in London, that they have actually done quite successfully, quite organised to get a living wage within the universities there. I think that's kind of some of the models that we could look to where there has been some success, because sometimes I think the arguments are that it's this kind of precarious work that you can't actually resist. But I think the evidence of Britain shows that you can actually organise and you can actually create some solidarity and resistance and be actually successful.
And that actually a good example was with ununionised agency cleaning. I think Queen Mary had a very good campaign.
Maybe one more and then Barbara. Okay. You and Barbara. Okay, because we have to leave it 10 minutes.
So just to address the question you raised regarding, and I thought that was really brilliant. Maybe because, well, I've only spent 1 year, engaging with critical race theory, not race critical theory. So I'll just stick with the one I know. And you're saying that what can we do, back in 10 years? And I think that one of the tenets of the critical race theory, 2 of them, which I think is really, really good, the way they in the States, the way critical race theory came about is that they look back, they walk back in retrospect, Brown versus Bowles and all of that. And I think that that's a powerful position that we're in, and we can look back to 10 years ago and say, this referendum, what was it really about? So is it, for me, I would see it as an interest convergence, So again, there was a time when Ireland said they wanted, our population was down, we needed to increase the number of people who was coming in here. And then they knew, the state knew the routes that people were using to come in here. And they did nothing about it because there was an interest convergence, because the state needed the population to increase, blah, 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 and when they felt, So again, it's analyzing this and changing the dominant discourse that is out there, unless again we begin to put out there, and one of the other tenets which I think I like that we can use to analyze what happened in that period and what all of that was about was looking at the counter stories really, that for people to tell their own counter stories that counters the dominant discourse. And I really think that those are like 2 major tenets which I think we can use. Work with people who can analyze it from a different perspective. Maybe somebody who's never been an immigrant, who's not been on the receiving end, and you've not had this racial uniform which you have to wear, you might not have the language. So again, is what critical race theory would encourage is find people who have the language, who understand some of those things and work with that. And that's where I would say, go with that. Concerning academics, well, I agree with the last person, the last lady contribution, because God, I work full-time, I parent 2 children, I run an NGO, I'm studying for my PhD, so it's mad to even just sit down to write, I have all of them everywhere. Just to put it down to submit an article is, I think I just submitted my first abstract, on Sunday, So again, it's all of those spaces. But the major challenge, I think, another one is the issue of what academics themselves, how are you supporting, say, for example, people with a different racial background. So I feel strongly that the academic world has this system where we're all assimilated into this form. And we have to speak this language. If you don't speak this language and these specific words, blah, 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 are not there, then you're not an academic. So first is relearning the language. So again, so what is, at the end of the day, what is knowledge? What is a good research? So is it the language that makes a good research? Or, so all of those spaces, and I think that those are things that academics really need to begin to do. And if not, they keep some people permanently out. And we're looking at inequalities and all of that. And if academia is reproducing that inequality, I think it's something that needs to be
Barbara, something very, very brief.
Well, very briefly. Okay, I wanted just to address the issue of the public sphere and how the three speakers were understanding it, and taking up Ken's issue of the black football manager. I think I've heard the black football manager discussed on the Today programme on BBC Radio 4. I'm sure it's been discussed on the internet more broadly. And obviously there's a whole issue of what university knowledge is doing in this world of the internet. And it's within the academy, the academics are extremely anxious about the students reading the internet, quoting it, God forbid. Right? So there's this whole anxiety about relationship to this new public sphere out there. But what I wanted to raise in relation to was black hashtags, Sanjay's work on black hashtags and the whole history of the internet in relation to popular music. Every new innovation is on the internet comes about, Twitter comes about, you know, because of Justin Bieber fans taking it over, YouTube, you know, major innovation for the popular music industry. All these new technologies being pushed by popular music. The whole issue of race in popular music is so important. And innovation happens the other way around. Innovation comes from African Americans to the white majority sphere. You get this whole cyclical cycles of innovation and appropriation happening in popular music, and it's still going on, right? The same with the black hashtags, right? It was cool for a little while to use African American slang in your hashtag on Twitter, and you get this whole reverse thing going on. And I just wondered whether the three of you, in the way you were addressing the public sphere of the media, were somehow looking at the reproduction of the official media in the new internet world, but not actually accounting for the whole popular conversation that goes on, particularly around popular music, celebrities, etc., on the internet. And when you start looking at it that way, then you have to see different flows going on in terms of the appropriation of racial discourses. That would be my view.
Very, very brief comment.
Very brief.
Thank you.
I mean, yeah, I agree with the question of appropriation of black culture. Historically, we've known for a very long time, pre-internet, particularly around music. Just a quick story, when we did a special issue of The Wire, we were the first ones to do that, actually. We edited the wiki page of The Wire, which is heavily policed. And the moment we edited it, our edit was removed. Basically, we linked the wiki page saying...
Wikipedia,
yeah, Wikipedia,
yeah,
sorry.
Yeah.
And it was heavily policed, wiki page, which is why it's so popular. And we had to enter into a convoluted, painful, excruciating discussion for the edit to be accepted. And what was ironic was Wikipedia declares itself as a kind of democratic, open space, but when you look at it, it's not. It's very elite. There's some elite editors. And we had to make the claim that this is the first journal that is doing something about, in terms of racial analysis of The Wire. So there's an irony in a sense that the maintenance of The Wire page, and The Wire, obviously the deeply racialized text, we were being denied the fact that we existed because we didn't have the authority, yet they were citing blogs and all sorts of weird other internet pages. So there's a very complicated politics around authority, race, what's seen as popular culture, what isn't. So my reading of the public sphere now, in terms of an internet public sphere, it's a multiplicity. It's not one centralised space anymore. There's different actors, there's different kind of forms of network power.
I'll end with a comment on the university again. And I think, whilst people have been talking about the need for solidarity with senior colleagues, and you sort of think that that would be a nice thing, especially as most of them would probably have gone through university for free, had grants and all that sort of stuff. So in the face of what's been happening, you'd think that there might be more outrage. In terms of the English context, I can tell you that basically, I can count on the fingers of one hand the number of us who've actually spoken out publicly against the attacks that have been going on what has just been the most shocking thing for me over the last 4 years since being involved in the campaign for the public university is how few senior academics have stood up and spoken out against the cuts that have been going on, and we have allowed the dismantling of the best public higher education system that existed in the world in terms of value for money, as well as, you know, whatever metrics you want to use. It was one of the best. And the government has now just admitted that the changes that they made will not save any money for the Treasury, that the new system is more expensive than the old system. So given that all of this was done in the name of fiscal austerity and to save money and so on, and within 4 years it's proven not to be the case, we have to acknowledge that this was a purely ideologically driven initiative in order to laden a generation with debt, remove education from the public, from public access, and return it once more to the reproduction of global elites and social elites. And I just think it's extraordinary that as academics we're complicit in this, because so few of us have stood up and actually said this is not to happen. And so if you're looking for solidarity from academics, I wouldn't even bother. I would just organise yourself and take back the university, because in a sense, we who are currently within it have let you down. We haven't managed to protect the university as a public institution. So it's going to land on your laps to actually take the actions that would be necessary to return the university to being a public institution. So you laugh.
Yeah, I mean, in the Irish context, I would echo that. I mean, it's something I've wondered over the last few years, why tenured academics are not capable of producing solidarity with other tenured academics in terms of their own self-interest, never mind recognising the changing conditions of work and precariousness within the university, and extending, you know, either everyday departmental or more institutional, politically organised solidarity. So I agree entirely. Something which would actually make manifest this contradiction and force people to think about what's happening in their own. You should be able to show them that picture that you showed me. You know, take their head out of the sand and see that ultimately this is also, you know, this is also an erosion of that thing. The fantasy they think they're pretending by being passive, or the fantasy they think they're protecting by being passive in relation to the assault on it. But I won't finish with that, because I mean I really liked what you're saying about thinking about, and what David was saying as well, about how to think about something like a commemoration and all the different kinds of politics that flow through the idea of commemoration as well. But one of the things I was thinking about, in terms of looking back and looking forward, is what's really interesting about looking at the citizenship referendum is that the very particular racializing forms of governance that it instigated have been kind of, and I think this is really where we get to the heart of thinking about neoliberal governance, have been brought to bear on the majority population over the last few years of crisis as well. I'm thinking about the clear stratification of populations in terms of who it's okay, for example, to allow to emigrate in the way in which that is framed, or the way in which youth unemployment is essentially about keeping people, circulating them in as many sort of Potemkin village-like work placement schemes as possible in order to, you know, play with the statistics and everything else. So there's that, and then there's also the kind of the way in which the citizenship referendum was about saying that immigrants that come here must be the perfect neoliberal citizen, they must be autonomous, they must be non-conflictual, they must be non-problematic, and be able to look after themselves and not draw on the state. You've got the same kind of discourse around welfare, around unemployment, around things which are clearly structural conditions of the kind of recession which we've had over the last few years. But those same kinds of governance are now being turned on other populations, where you're told, hey, look, if you wish it hard enough, Jeremy Gilpin has this idea of magical volition. If you just want it to happen hard enough, it'll happen for you. And if it doesn't, it's your own, it's a question of character. Those same kinds of governance, I think, have been trained in ways on wider populations that make sense really in terms of David's point, that we can look at the way in which different technologies of exclusion are increasingly brought to bear on different parts of the population. Now, of course, that doesn't remove the problem of racialization within the nation state, which is that the way in which those populations may, for example, conceive of their own exclusion may in many ways be different, if not irreconcilable. But I think we can certainly start to think in those ways. In other words, rather than commemorating something as having happened and having a locked-in significance, how could we begin to think of this as part of a kind of political archive of events which are about the management of the population of this island in particular ways?
Thank you very much. Just what I have to say that we've raised loads of questions about race critical scholarship, the nature of the university. We've gone kind of beyond RMA. This is my own last event which I organized because I'm retiring in September. I look at all of you who say universities to democratize it, to open it out. I might even come into some of the events that you're going to organize and some of the space that you're going to provide. And meanwhile, I will join Gavin in thinking about how we can commemorate the Ethnicity referendum, which to me was the turning point in turning Ireland from from a racial to a racist, from racist to a racial state, which it still remains, and it's worthwhile thinking together of what we can do. And it doesn't have to be a big thing, it can be loads of small things, but remember that we as academics have in a way been complicit, and we continue to be complicit in, as you say, not being committed to the public university. And wait for it, fees are coming, and fees will be so heavy that the universities will be unaffordable like they are in Britain. Thank you very much for 3 wonderful speakers.